Hello. Okay, great. We are excited to welcome you tonight as we get closer and count up to Shavuot. We last week we had Miriam Zami speak with us about Har Sinai, coercion and covenant, and we're going to drop the recording of that into the chat for those of you who'd like to listen. And tonight we have an exceptional treat. We have Dr. Nechama Price, who is, among other things, a very special friend to me. Dr. Price is the director of Yeshiva University's graduate program for advanced Talmud and Tanakh studies, GPATS. She's a clinical assistant professor of Judaic studies and Bible at Stern College for Women. She's a yoetzet. She teaches internationally, and I've had the privilege of working with her closely at Word by Word, a Sefaria fellowship to take 20 female writers across the finish line for Dr. Price's new book, and she'll be teaching a little bit about that tonight. Dr. Price, take it away.
Thank
Thanks
you
for being
so
here.
much. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And thank you to Eliza and to Shira for inviting me to speak here today. So I am going to share screen so we can look at the source sheet together and we will start our share. So give me 1 second to pick the correct screen for you. Okay. Perfect. Eliza, right screen? We got it? Okay, fantastic. All right. Hi, everybody. I thought we would get ready for Shavuos tonight, as it is next week, which is a bit scary to think about. And I thought I would combine that with, as Dr. Brown just said, my obsession with villains that has been on my mind lately. And that is because for the last 2 years, thank you to Dr. Brown and those at Safari, I've been working on a book called Villains of Genesis, which analyzes the lives of commonly known villains like Cain and Lod and Lavan and Yishmael and Esav to try to understand the goals of learning their stories and why Tanakh actually talks about them. The book is actually in print right now and will be on the shelves very, very soon, so everyone should look forward to that. But when we learn Tanakh, I think something that we do find is that we spend so much energy analyzing the heroes of every single story. We try to figure out from all different approaches, what did they do? What are their stories about? Why do we learn about them? But then when it comes to the villains, they're really one-dimensional. We really just look at them in this very one, I would say, very simplistic way. But we have to understand that the Torah included their stories and gave them so much details. So it must be that there's something to learn from the villains. And since, of course, Shavuos is approaching and we're going to be reading Megillat Rut, I wanted to discuss one of those characters that very often we put in the villain column, meaning we look at her in a more negative way, even if per se she's not necessarily this horrible villain. But if you actually take a step back, you realize that Megillat Rut doesn't really have any typical villains. There is no one fighting the Jewish people. There is no other nation involved, really, except for the fact that Elimelech and Machlon and Kilion go to the land of Moab. But even Moab itself within the Megillah is not a negative force. Chazal maybe does tell us that maybe the story is taking place in the time of Ehud, where Moab is our enemy, but there's no even hint of that at all in the Megillah. And if you notice in the story, the heroine, of course, is one of these Moabite women. So it's very hard to actually see the Megillah through the eyes of a villain, since there really is no typical villain within the Megillah. But we are left with what I would call the bad guys of the story. And if I wanted to categorize them between men and women, I would say the men are Elimelech, Machlon, Kilion, maybe you'd even say Ploni Almoni, the guy who doesn't want to marry Rut, but that would be a different shear. But today I wanted to focus on the female bad guy of the Megillah, which is, of course, Orpah. Now, the problem is, how do you write a shear on somebody who occupies only a few psukim of the Megillah? And then I realized when I took a step back that she reminded me of another female villain in Tanakh, and that is, of course, Vashti. Hence, the shear is called Orpah and Vashti, because if you think about Megillas Esther and Megillas Rus, there really is a very similar type of theme. Even though Megillas Esther, there is a villain, right? There are people who do try to destroy the Jewish people, and there is a big victory at the end of the hero saving us from destruction. But there's like a similar or a similar symmetry in the book. You have, in both of these two books, I mean, you have the parent, the mentor type character. You have Naomi and Mordechai, who really are the focus of the beginning and the ending of both of the Megillas. And then you have the younger relative, the mentee type character, the Rut and the Esther, who listen to everything that they're told by their adoptive parent figure. Then you have the male villains like the Achashverosh and the Haman, where interestingly in our Megillah, right, Avimelech has within his name the word Melech, the word king. And then you have that side character villain or the negative female character, which is Orpah and Vashti. And what's fascinating about Orpah and Vashti is that we are taught from a very young age to despise them and to degrade them and to view them as very negative characters. If you think about most preschool kids will bring home pictures, of Vashti or a puppet of Vashti, and she'll have pimples and she'll look terrible and maybe even a tail. But as we get older and we look at these two Megillas, we have to ask, what makes these two characters so evil? Why is it that we have this fundamental belief that Orpah and Vashti are both characters that we are meant to look at in a very negative way? What exactly do they do wrong? And that leads me, of course, to my source sheet that hopefully you're looking now at source number 1. When you look at the actions that they do in the Megillas, they don't seem too evil. If you look at source number 1 and you're thinking about Orpah, so what does she do? Vatishak Orpah lachamot. She kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and goes back home. She does not spit in her face. She does not curse her on her way out. She kisses her and says goodbye. Not only that, if you look at the second pasuk I gave you, she's doing what her mother-in-law tells her to do. Naomi says to both of her daughter-in-laws, Lichna, shovna isha lebeitima. Please go home. Please go back to your family. My sons have died. I have nothing left to give you. So shouldn't we praise Orpah for doing what she was asked to do and for doing it so graciously, kissing her mother-in-law goodbye? If you look at source number 2, I question also Vashti. What does Vashti do in the Megillah? Well, the first thing we know, Gam Vashti Hamalka Asta Mishtel Nashim, which is very nice. She makes a party for the women. Achashverosh has this big party with all the men. So comes Vashti the queen and says, oh, that's not fair. The women are excluded. So she goes and she makes a party for them. It sounds very nice. It even sounds very frum, separate parties, right? Separate genders. So nice. Sounds like a very nice thing. Then you continue in the story, starting with Pasuk Yud Aleph, still in source number 2. Her husband summons her to come to his party. Laharot ha'amim v'hasarim et yafya ki tovat marehi. Come, let everybody see your beauty because you are so beautiful. And of course, what does she do? She stands up for herself. Atima ein hamalka Vashti lavo. She refuses to go. And therefore, to some extent, you might think we should praise Vashti for refusing to go to Achashverosh's party and display herself in front of his guests. You would think being a spectacle, being stared at by everyone for your beauty would be something that is negative, and therefore, hopefully, one would think that her saying no is something that could be considered very virtuous, especially if you look at the Gemara Megillah that I gave you here in source number 2. One of the answers to the question of what did the Jews do wrong, which made them deserving of almost being destroyed, which is a question that is asked in the Gemara by the students of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And he says to them, you tell me an answer. What do you think is the answer? And if you look where I bolded, Amrulo, they suggest, because the Jews were involved in the party of Achashverosh, therefore sounding like going to the party of Achashverosh was something that is negative. And if that is something that is negative, don't you think we should praise Vashti for refusing to go? And therefore, when we begin our discussion here, we should start to grapple with that question. Why is it that we think Orpah and Vashti are evil? What is the reason behind why we all seem to have that view of even maybe not evil, but negative characters? And I think the simple answer is that we're biased by the view of Chazal. Very often when we are learning, we learn based on the way that Chazal views a very specific character. And certainly Chazal has that view when it comes to both of our characters. If you look at source number 3, just to give you an example, when it comes to Orpah, so in the Medrash Rabbah in source number 3, why is her name Orpah? Shehachva Oref lachamuta, because she turned her neck on her mother-in-law. She turned her back on her mother-in-law. She didn't do what her mother-in-law wanted. As opposed to Rut, shera'ata b'divrei chamuta, who does exactly what her mother-in-law wants. And therefore, certainly not nice. She leaves her mother-in-law when her mother-in-law was saying, please go, but really meant, please stay. But again, that doesn't necessarily make you a terrible person, but certainly something that one could look at in a slightly negative way. The Medrash Zuta takes it one step further. No, it's more than just turning her neck on her mother-in-law, but the language actually signals something that's a little bit worse. What is the language of Orpah? So says the Medrash, Shehayala la'oref ke'egla arufa. The language reminds us of the halacha of egla arufa. Egla arufa, which literally means a broken neck, but egla arufa means when you have a dead body that's abandoned near a city, they have to go and take responsibility for the fact that someone has been killed. What's that? What's that discussion? It's negligence, right? We did something wrong, which is why something like this could have happened, and therefore we have to take responsibility. The Medrash is saying she was negligent. She neglected and abandoned her mother-in-law, as opposed to, continue in the Medrash Zuta, Rut shemartechet atzma min ha'avera lasot ritzon shaviav shabbat shamayim. Rut, who does, of course, or stays away from the sin of Orpah, and rather does the will and what, of course, her father in the heavens wants, meaning what Hashem wants. She does what is correct in the eyes of Hashem. And therefore, right away, when you look at that Midrash, certainly Chazal is putting Orpah in the negative category. So too, if you look at the very famous Gemara that we have about Vashti in source number 4, you see a similar thing. The Gemara says, well, let's take something that looked positive. V'gam Vashti hamaka sta mishdela nashim. She makes a party for women. And if she's making a party for women, well, the pasuk told us it was in the palace. Why is it in the palace? Oh, says the Gemara, where I underline, Shnehem ledavar avera netkavnu. Because really both Vashti and Ahasuerus had this intention for sin. They wanted her to come to the party, and she wanted to come to the party. So why does she not come? But she didn't come to the party, and she refuses to come, not for good reasons, not because she says, I need to stand up for myself, but rather for immoral reasons, because of course she wanted to be there. The Gemara then goes on to ask, if you look where I bolded, my time aloat, if she really wanted to come, why doesn't she? Amar Rav Yossi bar Chananya melamed sheparcha bat saras umatznisan tena and that's where the Gemara comes to answer that something happened to her in that moment in a physical way. She got leprosy, she got saras, or she got a tail. And that's the reason she doesn't come. It's not because she doesn't want to come because she's standing up for herself. She doesn't want to come for superficial reasons because something happened to her body that she's now embarrassed to show up. Now, what's fascinating is if source number 5, the Mahari Kra, picking up on this, but a little more pshat than saying that she got saras and a tail, says, yes, if it was for superficial reasons that she didn't want to come, what could those superficial reasons be? And if you look at source number 5, he picks up on the fact that the pasuk says she refuses to go biyad hasarisim. She refuses to go with the eunuchs, meaning this lower level type of servant that was sent her way. Says the Mahari Kra in source 5, if Ahasuerus had just sent more honorable servants, people that she would have felt were, justified in bringing her, haytaba, then she would have come. But it was against herself to be able to go with these measly people. How could she go with these low-level people? She was waiting for Ahasuerus to send messengers that were more to her liking. And he parallels it, and I gave you the pasuk right below in Bamidbar Chavbet, to the story of Bilam and Balak, where Balak thought that maybe the reason Bilam wasn't coming is because the sarim that he sent were not dignified enough. And therefore Balak goes and sends sarim rabim v'nechbadim me'ela, sends more dignified sarim, officers, to bring Bilam because that's what he thought Bilam wanted. So too, says the Marikra, that is what Vashti was waiting for. And therefore what we have here is the details that we looked at before in the psukim that seem to justify what Orpah and Vashti were doing and actually make them into positive characters, and Chazal twists it to make it something that would be considered negative. But the question you have to ask is why? Why does Chazal do that? Why is Chazal so critical of them? What is that based on? And I think the answer when it comes to both of them is because the goal of having Orpah and Vashti within the psukim is to be what I like to call the contrast character, or others call the foil characters of our heroines, of Rut and Esther. Let me explain to you what I mean. If you look at source number 6, we start off the story in the Megillah of Rut and Orpah. And Rut and Orpah are introduced to us in the exact same way. There are two men that are brothers, Machlon and Kilion, who marry two women, meaning introduced in the same way, Nashim Moabiyot, two women that are Moabite women. One's name is Orpah, one's name is Rut, and they are both married to these brothers for 10 years. They both don't have children. Then the story continues. They both lose their husbands around the same time, and they're both told by their mother-in-law to turn back and to go home. And the Medrash even adds to that comparison, if you look at the Medrash Rabbah in source number 6, that both of them were the daughters of Eglon Melech Moab, which means they're sisters, according to Chazal. And therefore, you have two characters that are introduced to us as parallel characters. They're really the same up until this point in the story. When do they all of a sudden have something that's very different? Looking back at our source number 1, of course, when they go in different directions. Orpah says goodbye, and Rut goes with her mother-in-law. And therefore, if that's the moment in time where there is a divide, we have to therefore look at Orpah in a negative way in order for us to praise Rut for the decision that she made. If I want to glorify and praise Rut, then I have to say Orpah was wrong for doing the opposite. And that is why Chazal creates that contrast. If you look at Esther and Vashti, you have the exact same thing. If you look at source number 7 with me, they're both introduced as beautiful women. They are both introduced, if you look at Vashti, at Yafya, Kitovat Marahi, he wanted to show off her beauty because she was so beautiful. Esther as well, we are told, Yifat Tawar V'Tovat Mareh. She was really quite beautiful. And of course, as we know, they're both chosen by Achashverosh. They both get chosen to become queen, and they both, to some extent, get summoned by the king. And therefore, you would think in the moment where they act differently, if we want to make Esther look good, we have to make Vashti look bad. And therefore, if I'm in source number 8, where's the moment where they act differently? That's when Vatima'ain Hamalka Vashti, when Vashti refuses to listen to the king. She's disobedient to the king. And she says to the king, I'm not going to come. And she gets the king angry. And not only does she get the king angry, if you continue to look at the psukim that I'm sure we're so familiar with, Lo al hamelch levado as havashti hamalka. They decide it's not just against the king that Vashti has sinned against, but it's all of the husbands in the entire kingdom she has angered, because now all the women are going to come lahavzot ba'alehem, to shame their husbands, which means that's what we think Vashti is doing. She is being rude. She is shaming her husband, so too everyone will learn from her. And therefore, of course, when we look at that as the moment where Vashti is different than Esther, we look at the story of Esther in the exact opposite way. Esther is the obedient one. Esther is the pleasant one, the kind one, who's nice to everyone. Source number 9, there's an emphasis of the psukim. Ki Mordechai tziva aleh asher lo tagid. She doesn't tell her identity because Mordechai told her not to. And even when she's already in the palace, the psukim continue. If you look at the next pasuk, pasuk chaf, right? She continues to not tell who she is. Kasher tziva aleha Mordechai, just like Mordechai told her. And the pasuk continues. She continues to listen to Mordechai, just like when she grew up with him. And so too, if you look at the psukim that I gave in front of you in source number 9, when she is taken to the palace, she doesn't ask for anything. She's kind to everyone. Tisa chesed lefanav, vati Esther nosechin beinei kol ra'aha. Everybody loves Esther because Esther is kind to everyone. And therefore, what we see very clearly here, right, is that Esther is being pinned as the opposite of Vashti. If we want to say Esther is the heroine for being kind and obedient, then we want to make sure that we make Vashti into the opposite persona. She's rude and therefore she's evil. Now, it's not just, of course, the psukim themselves that make this contrast. Chazal expands it and expands it in a tremendous way. If you look at source number 10 with me, you'll see the first expansion, which is if you go back to the story of Orpah and Rut, where, of course, Chazal expands that contrast. So yes, it is true. Orpah goes home and Rut continues, right? Rut is the one who takes care of her mother-in-law, and Orpah is the one who abandons her. But Chazal makes it bigger. She's corrupt, Orpah, as opposed to Rut, Rut, who is, of course, righteous. If you look at source number 10, I gave you two midrashim where this comes out. In the Medrash Rabbah, we have about Orpah, Kol ota halayla shepirsha Orpah mechamota, nitarvu ba mea aralot shel goyim. Whoa, right? That night, forget about the rest of her life. Even that night, she ends up being with 100 people from a different nation, meaning she has relations with tons and tons of people that night. That's what shows how corrupt Orpah is. The Zohar Chodesh says, well, not only is it that she was with people from her own land, right? She goes back to the field of Moab, Vizanta, Lo Kiblua, but they didn't want her. So then she goes to the land of Plishtim, and she ends up having 6 children with 6 different men, being a zonah, being somebody with a profession of a prostitute. And therefore, what Chazal is doing is telling us Orpah went off the deep end in terms of her promiscuity, in terms of her corruption. And what does that do for us? That builds Rut on the other side. Rut, of course, who is tznius. Rut, of course, who is the opposite of everything we just said. If you look at source number 11, you see that in Chazal as well, where in the pasuk we have a very strange question that Boaz asks his people. Lemi hanara hazo, when she's in the field, who is this girl? And the Gemara in Shabbos asks the following question, where I bolded, Boaz l'shol b'nara. Is it normal that Boaz asks about girls in the field? What's going on? And the Gemara answers no, because there was something special about her. Either, of course, he saw davar chachma rabba, there was something very wise about what she was doing, or davar tznias rabba, or the way she was standing and the way she was sitting and getting up and down, she was doing it b'tznias. And therefore comes Chazal to create this contrast in a bigger way. Orpah, the promiscuous one, Rut, the extra tznius one. We see that as well, that Chazal builds this contrast between Vashti and Esther in an incredible way as well. If you look at source number 12 with me, you have the discussion of the Oh, I'm sorry, in source number 12. Yes, exactly. Source number 12 with me. You have a discussion in the Gemara of what Vashti actually said to Achashverosh at the party. And in order for us to really understand how rude and how mean Vashti is, according to Chazal, if you look at the language of the Gemara in source number 12, she says the Gemara asks the following question, Amai dal kabe kulehai, why did Achashverosh get so angry? Why was it like a fire burning inside of him? What did she say that made him so mad? Amar Rava says, Shalchale, she sends him a message. Bara hurarya de Abba, you, the stable boy of my father. Abba lekabel alpha chamre shasev elarave. My father could drink wine, whatever this means, equivalent to what 1,000 people could drink and didn't get drunk. Hahu gavra ashte bachamre. But you, my husband, you drink a little bit and you get drunk. Now, it doesn't sound like such an insult to me, but seemingly that was a tremendous, tremendous insult to say to Achashverosh, and that is why Chamato Barabo, he got so angry. And therefore, Chazal is building a Vashti. It's not just she said no, but she said no in a mean way. She was obnoxious to him. She hit him where it hurts. She insulted him, and she insulted him in a very public way, which of course is the opposite of Esther, as we mentioned before, and I give you that pasuk again in source number 12, V'tisachein v'chesed lefanav. It's not just she was nice to everyone. She was nice to the king, and that's why he picked her. She was kind to him. She was nice to him. She was for sure the opposite of the way the Chazal is looking at Vashti. But I want to show you that Chazal makes this contrast bigger in two more places. Number one, in just the usage of Shabbos in the story of the Megillah. If you look at source 13, the Gemara wants to know why specifically does Vashti get killed by Yom HaShvi on the 7th day. And the Gemara Megillah tells us that it's because she does something on Shabbos that actually makes her incredibly evil. And again, where I bolded, Melamed shayta Vashti harishah mevia benot Yisrael umafshitan arumovo se bahem malacha b'Shabbos. She would take Jewish girls and she would undress them, make them naked, and make them work on Shabbos. And therefore, the Gemara says, Miza keneged Miza, she's summoned by the king to come out naked on Shabbos. And of course, she gets decreed to be killed on Shabbos. So we take the concept of Shabbos by Vashti and we villainize her in a very strong way. as opposed to the opposite that Chazal does when it comes to the concept of Shabbos by Esther. If you look again in the pasuk, there's a strange detail that she has seven servants, right? Seven women that work for her in the palace. And comes our Gemara to tell us that's to teach us Shaita Monebahem Yimei Shabbos, that Esther, through knowing which is the maidservant that comes to her room on Shabbos, would be able to keep track of what day is Shabbos and to be able to keep Shabbos. So here we feel Chazal is creating that contrast and making it even bigger. Vashti, who makes people violate Shabbos, right, in a demoralizing way, and Esther, who made sure in the palace to keep Shabbos. But I want to make it even bigger because it's not just them as a person. One is mean and one is nice. One makes people violate Shabbos and one keeps Shabbos. But it's their entire big picture of how they look at Am Yisrael. If you look at source 14 with me, Chazal brings out about Vashti something very fascinating. Number one, that she is the Bat Bino Shel Nebuchadnezzar Harasha, that she is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who of course is the one that destroys the Beit HaMikdash. So already Vashti brings us to the story of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And the Medrash brings out, why does God make Vashti suffer? Why does he give her a tail or tsaras? Lama sala kadosh baruch hu kach? Why does Hashem do this? Bishvil shalo hanicha lachashverosh litain rishus lebnot Beit HaMikdash. Because at some point, right, we are in the time where we're about to rebuild, or we have already rebuilt, it's big machloket, the second Beit HaMikdash, and she's the one that doesn't let Achashverosh let us have permission to either build or to rebuild. Lo henicha lo, she does not let him. So again, here we have Vashti, who's connected to someone who destroys the Beit HaMikdash, and according to Chazal, doesn't allow us to rebuild, as opposed to Esther, according to Chazal, where we see in the Medrash Rabbah that I gave you, Amar Rabbi Huda Rabbi Simon, Daryavesh Acharon Benashal Esther Haya. According to Chazal, Daryavesh, who is the one that gives us permission to continue building the Beit HaMikdash after it pauses in the time of Koresh, who is he? Oh, he's the son of Esther. And therefore, what we have here is this incredible contrast of Vashti is the one who stops the building, and Esther is the one who allows us to continue building. And of course, we know from Ezra, Perek Vav, that it's Daryavesh's decree that allows the Jews to continue building the Beit HaMikdash. So here's what we're seeing is happening. Within the Psukim, yes, there is this almost comparison that you're feeling between Orpah and Rut and Vashti and Esther. And therefore, in order to make our heroines look amazing, Chazal expands the contrast between them to make our villains look even worse, to make our heroines look even better. So that's exactly what's going on. But then you realize that you can do this even from the psukim themselves. Because if we look at the way that you can parallel the stories of our villains that we're calling them in these psukim, you see that by paralleling them to other people in Tanakh, they do start to look a little bit more evil than they do from just looking at the Megillah itself. I'll give you an example. If you think about the story of Orpah, what's the story, right? She is told to leave behind the chosen people, which is what she was returning back to the land of Israel, and to return back home to her father's home, which is the exact opposite, of course, of source 15, which is what Abraham does. Abram leaves behind his father, his Artzacha, his Moladetcha, his land and his birthplace, to go to Eretz Yisrael to form the Jewish people. So too Rivka is told that she has a choice to leave behind her family and her land to go to the land of Israel and be the mother of the Jewish people. And of course, as we know, Vatomer Elich, she says, of course, I will go. Even Rachel and Leah are given a choice at some point when they're living in the house of Lavan or a few days distance away. And Yaakov says to them, are you willing to leave your father behind and go with me to the land of Eretz Yisrael? And their answer is, we no longer have any part in our father's home. We will go with you. And therefore, if you look at Orpah as the opposite of the Avraham, of the Rivka, of the Rachel and the Leah, who's choosing to leave behind, right, her ability to join the Jewish people and not go to the land of Israel, then obviously that makes her look much more negative within the pshat of the psukim. But if I make it even bigger, it's not just I don't want to go to the land of Israel, but I don't want to be part of the Jewish people. Then there's a rejection to being part of the Jewish nation and the values of the Jewish people. If you look at source 16 with me, when Ami is talking to her, she says, go back to your nation and go back to your gods, right? Go back to what you believe in. Leave behind the values of the Jewish people. And certainly if we're looking at the psukim by Rut, her reaction isn't, I just want to come with you, Naomi, because I want to take care of you. But it's Amecha mi, Velokayecha Elokai. Your nation is now going to be my nation, and your God is going to be my God. And therefore, it's much bigger than just, I want to be with you, my mother-in-law, but it's, I want to be part of the world that you're in. I want to be part of the Jewish people. And that is exactly the way, if you look at the next pasuk I gave you here in Rut Perek Bet, when Boaz is describing to Rut the amazing thing that she did, look at the language because it parallels the language we mentioned by Abraham and by Rivka. V'ta'azvi avich v'imich ve'eretz moladetech. You left behind, right, your parents, and you left behind your birthplace. And what did you do? V'talchi el am asher lo yadat. You went to a new nation. It's not just, again, you followed your mother-in-law. You joined a new nation that you didn't know before, and God will therefore repay you for it. Ruth, therefore, becomes part of the Jewish people, which of course leads her to David HaMelech. Orpah, of course, refuses to be part of the Jewish people, goes back to her own nation, and therefore does not get to join the Jewish people. Now, that's in terms of Orpah, where you can understand from the psukim and parallel stories why we're going to build her to be something that's much more negative. But if I return to Vashti, I was wondering, is there any stories that I could look at that are somewhat similar to Vashti? And I think this one's not as easy, but I will try. If you look at source number 17 with me, I certainly do see those that parallel Esther to some extent. I could take Sarah and I could take Esther, and I could parallel them to each other in source 17. Both of them, interestingly, get taken twice, right? Sarah, it's two different kings. One is, of course, Paro and Perek. One is Avimelech and Paraclef. Esther is first taken to the palace and then, after a period of time, is taken again to the king. And in both of these situations, the women, to some extent, have to act in a much more passive way, but their stories turn into one where they are saved in a miraculous way, where their male counterparts actually leave with prestige and a new position. And therefore, because of that, positivity comes out. Avram and Sarah are able to spread Shem Hashem, and obviously Sarah is saved within that story and becomes, of course, the mother of Yitzhak, the mother of the Jewish people. And in the Esther story, she and Mordechai ends with a power of a position of power. They both together save the Jewish people and become leaders of the Jewish people. So the parallel of Esther to Sarah really brings out the beauty of the Esther story versus Vashti, who kind of loses her opportunity to use her power for good by standing up to the king in the way that she does. And to some extent, it reminds me of the story of Michal that I gave you here in source number 18, where if you think about it, there's a party that is taking place by the king. David, of course, is the king that I'm talking about, and he's making a party. He's dancing and singing because the Aron has just made it to Yerushalayim, and it was a failed attempt the first time. So he's very, very excited, and he's dancing and he's dancing, and comes his wife outside and screams at him in a very public fashion. Malach bad hayom melech Israel. What type of honor to the Jewish king, right? That you're dancing in such a way in front of everyone. And what's interesting within that story, she compares him, meaning there's a comparison between David and Shaul, which again is taking us back to our story here of Vashti that we're comparing to her grandfather of Nebuchadnezzar, where David turns to Michal and says, you're acting like your dad, right? You're not acting the way that I think is right, which is to celebrate Hashem. You're more nervous about the prestige of the king and how it looks for the king to be dancing. You're acting like your father. And in this story, by the way, Michal is punished at the end, as I gave you here in Pasuk Chaf Gimel. V'lo hayala yaled ad yom motah. She doesn't have children the day she dies. And what we certainly do know, however you understand that line, she does not birth the heir to the throne, which you would have expected. The daughter of Shaul married to David, right?
Yeah,
The first.
that would have been perfect. Her
It
name is
would have been
Nechama
perfect,
Price.
who's ever talking, right? Who would have been the perfect heir to the throne. I'm with you on that. And of course, this is the story that to some extent reveals that Michal does not get that honor, right? And therefore, what we have here is somebody who comes out and screams at the king in a very public fashion, looked at in a much more negative way. Obviously, I'm not comparing Michal to Vashti to the extreme of that, but I understand how the parallel story kind of brings out a much more negative tone when it comes to Vashti. But we have to understand understand that Chazal is really taking it one more step, because Chazal is therefore saying to us, if we're going to look at Orpah and Vashti in such a negative way, then we're going to give them almost a Mida Keneged Mida ending, right? We're going to give them a terrible ending to their story to bring to full circle how terrible these people are. If you look at source number 19 with me, right, going back to our Orpah story, there's a different version found in the Gemara of this distinction between Rut and Orpah. And if you look, the Gemara in Sota tells us, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu Yavo b'nei hanishuka v'yiplu lefaneha b'nei hadvuka. The children of the one who kissed, meaning Orpah, who kisses Naomi goodbye, are going to fall to the children of the one who stuck by Naomi, meaning the children of Orpah are going to fall to the children of Rut. What exactly is this midrash talking about? We see hint to it, by the way, in the midrash I read to you earlier, the Zohar Chodesh. I ended it early, which is after she goes and she has all these children, right, in the land of Plishtim, Kulam naflu biyad David, they all fall to David, Shaya ben Binah shel Rut, which of course David comes from Rut. And we know that David is the one who kills many, many of the Plishtim, and certainly a lot of the big giants and warriors of the Plishtim is killed by David. But if you look a little bit closer, if you look at source number 20, there is a pasuk that is found in Shmuel Beh discussing Goliath the giant, right, that we are all very familiar with, who threatens the Jewish people. And it tells us, V'gam hu yulad leharafa. He is born to Harafa. Now, the pshat is not to translate this as Orpah, but Chazal certainly does so. As you see in the Medrash Zuta, the ending of the Medrash I was reading to you before, Amru oto halayla aruba mea aralo plishtim v'yatsa mimenu Goliath hagiti haplishti. Who is the child of Orpah? That is Goliath. And of course, as we know from source 21, which is the ending of our Megillah, we know that from Rut and Boaz comes Oved, and Oved leads us to David. And therefore, of course, what is Chazal building for us as the ending of the story of Orpah? Orpah's ending is, of course, Goliath. And the ending of Rut is David, which is what the Megillah tells us. And as we know in Shmuel Aleph Perek Zayin, it gave you the psukim, they come opposed to each other. And what, of course, happens, Goliath stands for armor and kochi va'otzam yadi and physical strength of a person. And David stands for, as he says so beautifully, you come at me with cherev v'chidon, you come at me with your weapons. Anochi ba'elecha b'shem Hashem Svakot. I represent Hashem. And of course, what happens in the psukim, he knocks him down, right, with his slingshot, then cuts off his head, and David kills Goliath. And therefore, the ending of the story, according to Chazal, of this massive contrast between Rut and Orpah is not just Orpah goes home and Rut stays, but the future of their descendants come at a head with each other. And David, of course, coming from Rut, kills the descendant of Orpah, and that is Goliath. It's amazing how Chazal brings this entire story together as the heroine versus, of course, the villain. What happens to Vashti according to Chazal? Let's play this out. Well, according to Chazal, if you look at source number 22, Vashti is killed. But if you look at the language in source number 22, the pasuk tells us that when they are saying what's going to happen to Vashti, the language that's used is Malchuta yitain hamelech lereuta hatova mimena. We are going to give her kingship, her queenship, whatever you want to say, to the friend that is better than her. Now, Vashti and Esther are not friends, right? But that language is, of course, supposed to trigger for us a pasuk that's found in Shmuel Aleph Perek Vav that I gave you, which is the language that Shmuel Hanavi uses when he's talking to Shaul. And he's telling Shaul, you're going to lose your melucha, minatzna l'reyacha hatov mimecha, and it will be given to your friend that is greater than you. At that time, also, Shaul and David are not friends, but that is the way of hinting that someone who is greater than you, someone who is really opposed to you and different than you in every way, is going to be the one who's going to take over for you. And therefore, the ending of the Vashti story is really brought down as Vashti versus Esther. Esther, the greater friend, the one who is the one that is deserving. Vashti, of course, who ends up being killed, is the one who is not deserving. And if you look at the psukim continue, when Esther is chosen, it reminds us, Vayimlicheha tachas Vashti. She is now given the queenship instead of Vashti. She directly replaces Vashti. And therefore, as opposed to Vashti, who no longer has the power to do anything, Esther, of course, is able able to live. Esther is able to come to the king. Esther is offered half of the kingdom. Esther is promoted later in the story, as I gave you, and is given the house of Haman. Esther is able to rise as Vashti, of course, goes down. Now, this is certainly the picture that is presented to us through Chazal, and as I presented to you through the Psukim as well. However, I think there is another approach. And I think the other approach is to ask ourselves again, are they really villains? Do I have to look at Orpah and Vashti in such a negative way? Could I say that they didn't do anything wrong? Or could I even say maybe they attempted to do something that could be looked at as something that is positive? Maybe Orpah was not wrong to go home. Maybe Vashti was allowed and should have stood up for her own dignity. Can I look at them differently? And I think the Psukim a little bit push us to look at it differently. And I want to show you where I see it. If you look at source number 23, Psukim we've already looked at together, which is the introduction of Orpah and Rut, there is something very strange because the way they're introduced is Orpah is introduced first. Shem hachat Orpah, the Shem hasheni Rut. Orpah is introduced first and Rut is introduced second. Now, my first thought is, oh, that's because Orpah is married to the older brother and Rut is married to the younger brother. But as we know, as I gave you the psukim right afterwards, right, when we're introduced to Machlon and Kilyon, Machlon's name is first and Kilyon's name is second. And we know from the psukim that Rut is married to Machlon. And therefore, I would have expected a matchup. Rut, then Orpah, married to Machlon, then Kilyon. The fact that Orpah's name comes first is very, very strange. And if you look throughout Tanakh, yes, it is true that sometimes we say names are in order of age, and maybe I could argue Orpah is older than Rut, and that's all I'm meant to learn. But most of the time, and I would say many examples I'm about to show you, it's the person of more significance that seems to come first. And therefore, if you look at the examples I gave you in source 24, the order of Shem, Cham, and Yafet, even though we have a pasuk that seemingly shows that Yafet is Hagadol, Yafet is the oldest. Also by Avraham, Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin that I gave you here asks the question, what is this order? Is it age order or is it something else? And the Gemara concludes that sometimes it's age order, but concludes that this is Derech Chachma Tapka Chashiv Lehu. It's really about significance. Avraham is the most significant. Shem is the most significant. You see it again in Yitzchak. Yitzchak comes before Yishmael, even though Yishmael is older. Yitzchak is more significant. Ephraim comes before Menashe because he's more significant. So I have to question, why is it that Orpah comes before Rut? Is there something I'm meant to realize by the fact her name comes first? I'll add another detail. Source number 25, if I look closely at the psukim, it happens to be that Naomi asks them to go home 4 times. Shovna, please go home. Shovna benotai, Shovna benotai. And then finally to Rut, please go back after Yibamtech. Please follow your sister-in-law or whatever you call her, the one who's married, right, to your husband, brothers, right? Please go back after her, right? There's almost like a begging, like Naomi wants them to go back. And Rut is the one who doesn't understand that that's what Naomi wants. If you look at the Dot Mikra, that's exactly what the Dot Mikra says. If you look closely, Naomi is the one who, I'm sorry, Orpah is the one, Shekibla Divrei Naomi. She's the one who listened to Naomi and did what Naomi wanted her to do. Rut does the opposite. About Rut good. She goes against what Naomi seems to want. Now, you may say to me, what are you talking about? Why would Naomi want to be alone? Why would Naomi want them to leave? Well, look at Rut Zutra for a second with me, because I think it gives us a clue, which says, Mipnei ma hayta machzeret otan. Why did she want them to leave? Kidei shelo titbayesh bahem. Because Naomi did not want to be embarrassed by her daughter-in-laws. Think about it. How can I go back into Eretz Yisrael with these 2 women? And people are going to say, where did they come from? And she'll say, well, they're my daughter-in-laws. How do you have daughter-in-laws that are from Moab? And all of a sudden, the whole story is going to come out. Yes, we left the land of Israel for Moab. They didn't know where they went. We went to the land of Moab. Yes, we deserted you, right, for the nation that even according to Chazal, maybe is the enemy at the time. And yes, my sons intermarried into people from Moab. And therefore, here I have my Moabite daughter-in-laws. And therefore, it is very possible that she didn't want them to come with her. And Orpah understood that, but Rut did not. And therefore, if you continue to look at the psukim, you can understand why when they show up, all the people say, but Tomar Nahazot Naomi, is this Naomi? Is this really what happened to her? They didn't know what happened to her. And then nobody helps her and nobody talks to her. And she has to pick food off the ground. Throughout the entire Megillah, everybody shuns Naomi until Boaz marries Ruth. And therefore, maybe one could understand from the way the psukim are being told or telling us the story that Orpah didn't do anything wrong. Maybe Orpah did exactly what Naomi wanted her to do. And therefore, you have to ask, why is it, if that is so, that the Midrashim seem to want to vilify Orpah? Why do they want to make Orpah look bad if, when I look at the story again, I could understand why I might want to look at her as a positive character? And I wonder, and very often when you have these contrast characters, the reason why I make the villain look worse is because I want to make sure that we don't look at the hero in a negative way. What do I mean by that? What did they do to Orpah? They made her promiscuous. They made her corrupt. They made her the opposite of what we would call someone who is sneas. Well, let's look again at the story of Ruth. If you look at source 26 with me, I again ask the question, why is Boaz saying, Lemi hana azot? And again, the Gemara is asking, V'chidarcho shel Boaz l'shol b'na'ara? Maybe she was acting in a way that made him inquire about her. Maybe she was acting in a way that we might nervously think was inappropriate. Therefore, we make Orpah the opposite to make sure we can make sure everyone knows, no, Ruth is the sneakiest one. Let me show you another hint to where we might question Ruth within the psukim. If you look at source number 27, a fascinating thing within the psukim. In source number 27, when Boaz is talking to Ruth and saying, you're going to come to my field and you're going to stay in my field, he says to her that with the female attendants, that's where you're going to stay. V'kol tidbekin im narotai. Stay with the female attendants. Now you see Pasach Chaf Aleph, Ruth comes home. She doesn't chop what he's saying. So she says to Naomi, oh, I was talking to this guy Boaz, and he told me, im hane'arim asher li tidbekun. I should stay with the male attendants in his field. Now, the Malbim, of course, always picks up on this change of language. And if you look at the Malbim inside, he says very nicely, Rak basher hi hayta Moaviyah. She was a Moabite. Visham ein mitrachakim min ha'arim. And there is no separation of genders. And therefore, she thought he was telling her to hang out with the guys and find a nice guy to marry. That's what she thought. So Boaz was telling her, don't do that, but she didn't pick up on it. So what happens next? If you look at source 28, Naomi has to correct her. And Naomi says back to her, no, ki teitziim narotav. No, stay with the females, not with the males. And Ibn Ezra picks up on this. She's saying, loim na'arav, not with the boys. And again, Malbim says it again. Naomi figured out that this is what she didn't understand because she didn't have the same values. So she was teaching her, no, you have to hang out with the girls because we don't want anyone to be suspicious of you. So what does she do at the end? V'tidbak b'na'arot Boaz, she hangs out with the girls. What's this language and this focus within the psukim? It's teaching us that Ruth is learning the values of the Jewish people, that Ruth herself per se, from the beginning, isn't this incredible tznius character that we are meant to learn about, that we are supposed to think about, that that's how she was from the very beginning. But rather, Chazal creates Orpah into this corrupt character to elevate Ruth, who's the opposite, looking at her in a tznius way. And of course, that's very helpful when you get to source 29, which is, of course, the story where you don't really know what to do with this fact, where Ruth dresses up to seduce Boaz in the field and comes into the field when he's sleeping. She could have asked him the next morning, but she does it in a very seductive way. And therefore, what does Chazal do when we have in the psukim something that's confusing about the hero? Now, again, we could take the pshat and understand the confusion of the hero and what she has to do in order to be able to get to the result that she wants. But Chazal is going to build up the contrast character into being the most promiscuous type of character, and therefore elevate Ruth to be the opposite, to be the sneakiest one, to be the one that we're meant to emulate. If you look at the Vashti versus Esther, you can see that exactly the same way. Because again, I can look at Vashti as a pretty positive character. I can look to her, if you look at source number 30, especially if I take a famous midrash that we're all very familiar with, that when he tells her to come, he says, Beketer Malchus, come in the crown. And the Gemara Megillah actually gives us a story of Achashverosh talking to the other officers, and they're having a competition. The women in my kingdom are beautiful. No, mine are the most beautiful. And Achashverosh is saying, my wife is the most beautiful. And he calls her the kli she'ani mishtamesh bo, the vessel that I use. And they say, fine, bring her out, but bring her out aruma, bring her out naked. And therefore, I could understand that if that's what the story is, Vashti coming out that way would be completely inappropriate. And I could look at Vashti as a positive figure. And mind you, many of the Mefarshim do build up Vashti. If you look at source 31 with me, Ibn Ezra says, why did she not want to come out? It's not because she had a tail and it's not because she had saras. But avur sechroto nitpachta lavo, because she knew he was drunk. She was scared to come out. She didn't know what Achashverosh was going to do, and she knows what he does when he's drunk. Or source 32, if you look at Rav Moshe ben Yitzchak Chalav, he points out in his Mefarish that she realized that she can't come to the party. I love his answer. Vashti says, I'm having a party. I can't leave all my guests behind. He was only summoning me. How rude would that be if I left all the female guests behind to go to a different party? But the ones I like the most is source 33, Rabbeinu Bachai and the Mahari Kra, who build it out as actually an act of tznius of Vashti. How could it be that she could go out in such a way? Women normally hide. They don't go out in public like that. Or the Mahari who uses the pasuk from Tehillim called Kvoda Bat Melech Penima, right? Which certainly is a pasuk that we use to discuss the value of tznius. There was something about Vashti that she was saying, no, I will not go out in such a way. Not only that, source 34, when they're worried about the fact that all the husbands are now going to have their wives rebel to them and not listen to them. Well, the Mefarshim point out, as I gave you here, Kikoli Shata Sekamoha. She was a role model to all the other women. So therefore, they were nervous that she was going to act, or the other women were going to copy and emulate her and act in the exact same way. And therefore, one could understand that maybe Vashti here did something that was pretty positive. Not only that, many of the Mefarshim assume that Achashverosh acted in an irrational way. She did not deserve to die. She did not deserve the punishment that she got. If you look at source 35 with me, it tells us that only after he no longer was angry, he remembers Vashti and he remembers what he decreed. And if you look at some of these mafarshim, we'll do some outside so we can end on time, right? The Dot Mikra points out for us that he reacted in such a way because he was drunk, because he was angry. This was not something that she deserved, and he regretted what he did. Or the Ralbag, look at his language. She didn't deserve it because even he realized she astaza blitznias. She did it because of tznias. She did it because she didn't think going out in such a way was the way she was supposed to act. And therefore, maybe Vashti did the right thing, and we are supposed to learn something from Vashti. But the problem that, of course, comes about, which is what Chazal wants to fight against and tell us, no, Vashti was wrong, and Vashti did this in a terrible way, is because if I highlight Vashti as the one who said no to the king and I make it positive, then all of a sudden I start to question, what do I do with Esther, who doesn't say no to the king, right? Who ends up marrying the king and being with the king. And of course, we know the Chazal struggles with this. Source number 7, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Esther Karka Olam Haita. She acted very passive, and that's why she was able to act the way that she did. Or the Gemara in Megillah that I gave you, where the Gemaras go on to say, no, but she kept Shabbos. Oh, no, but she kept kosher, just like in a parallel to Daniel. And no, she kept Nida, right? Like, don't worry, she was acting like a frum Jew within the palace. Or even more so, which again, as a Yoetzet, I always have a very hard time with the Gemara that says this, which is that she really went back and forth between the king and Mordechai, right? If you look here, Yoshevet B'cheiko Shel Mordechai, she was really married to Mordechai, and she would go to the mikvah and go back to Mordechai. What's the Gemara trying to do? No, don't look at Esther in this terrible way. No, Esther really did exactly what she was supposed to do. She kept all of her Jewish values. She kept her identity as a Jew. Look at Esther in this very positive way. But now that I understand that that's what Chazal is doing, they're trying to make sure that we focus and we know that the hero is the good guy and the villain is the bad guy. Well, can we take a step back and say, what can we learn though? If we just look at Orpah as a positive figure or a neutral figure, and what if we look at Vashti as a positive or a neutral figure? What are we meant to learn? And I'm telling you that if you look again back at both Megillas, there's actually a nice way to end both of their stories. Nowhere does it say anything negative about Orpah's ending, and therefore maybe she goes home and she marries a man and she has a nice family and everything is lovely because no one says Harafa has to be Orpah. And mind you, maybe Vashti herself wasn't even killed. If you look closely at the pasuk in source 38, it just says Asher lo tavo Vashti lefnei hamelech. She can't come in front of the king. Yes, Rashi Rashi, based on Chazal, says Lakach neharga, she was killed. But if you look at a lot of the other Mefarshim, she wasn't. She was just banished from the palace. She wasn't allowed to come in front of the king again. Source 39, the Rashbam, Yirgasheno mebeito, she got kicked out of the palace, but she lives the rest of her life. Or again, if we look at Rav Regio, which I think is fantastic, and you could look at it, the source sheet I believe is in the chat, you could read it inside. It was just Mida Keneged Mida. You don't come to the king when the king calls, so now you can't come to the king anymore. But really, in reality, she probably was left like a pilegesh, like a concubine, living in a palace, right? Living a very good life, just no longer able to come to the king. Reminds me, I gave you the parallel here in source 40 of the daughter of Yiftach, where we don't know, does he, when he swears, I will set her aside for God, did she get killed, right? Is Vashti killed? Or is she just set aside, right? And no longer can come to the king, just like the daughter of Yiftach maybe is just set aside. And therefore, you have to ask the following question. If they are not the villains, then why do we hear about them and what are we meant to learn? And I think that to some extent, when it comes to Orpah, it's very straightforward. She could be the character, certainly, who does what I would call the normal, right? Your husband is dead. Your mother-in-law is saying, go home. I have nothing left to give you. So Orpah does what most people would do, which is goes home, you know? But what does that do for us? It contrasts us to Ruth and makes her extraordinary. It's not normal to stay with Naomi. It's not normal to pick food off the ground when you could go back home and have a different life. I need Orpah to be the contrast, but not the good versus the bad, almost the normal versus the extraordinary. And by using Orpah in the story, I can actually look at Ruth in this extraordinary way. So too, like Ploni Almoni, I could look at him as a bad character who won't marry Ruth, or I could look at her as somebody who's normal. But that makes Boaz extraordinary, that he will risk his reputation, that he will risk everything in order to marry Ruth. And therefore, we have in the Megillah is actually the story of some negative characters, some normal characters, and then extraordinary characters. And those extraordinary characters, which is Ruth and Boaz, become the grandparents of David, who is, of course, extraordinary. But when it comes to Vashti, I think Vashti has a lot more for us to talk about in the few minutes we have left. Because what do I do with Vashti? If Vashti is not the negative to the positive Esther, then what is she? What's her goal in the story? And I actually want to give you one more parallel here in source number 41, which is the Sar HaOfim. In the story of the dreams of, or I should say, the story of Yosef and the story of Paro, we have two officers that get thrown into jail with Yosef, the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfim, two different officers. And as we know, they both have dreams. They both get interpreted by Yosef. One dies and one, of course, is allowed to live. And what's fascinating about the parallel is, if you look at the psukim in front of you, there is a party that's being made by the king. And on the day of the party that's made by the king, we have the Sar HaOfim who is killed, paralleling for us the party of Achashverosh where Vashti is killed. And the question, of course, that you have in that story of Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim, what do I need Sar HaOfim for? I know why I need Sar HaMashkim, because he's going to end up telling Paro about Yosef, who's stuck in jail. But what do I need Sar HaOfim for? What I need him for is the contrast. We have two people who are in front of Paro who do something that's wrong. Yes, I could look at Sar HaOfim as doing something worse than Sar HaMashkim, but in the psukim, they're almost exactly the same. And if you look at the way Sar HaMashkim tells over the story here in the psukim, it's there were two of us. We were both in jail. We both had a dream. We both got our dream interpreted. One of us lived and one of us died. It's almost like trying to pick up on the randomness of who lives and who dies, the non-predictability of Paro within the story. He can kill you on a moment for no reason whatsoever and let somebody else live. And I think that's the exact same story with Vashti. She is killed in that party, and you almost have this feel of the fear or the danger of Ahasuerus, someone who at a whim can take someone he loves, that in 1 minute is like, come, look at the beauty of my queen, and in the next minute is like, kill her because she didn't listen to me, and all of a sudden she's going to die. And that storyline of Vashti helps us to understand the story of Esther, how scary that was for her to appear to Ahasuerus that day and say, can I speak to you? Can I ask you for a favor? Because in a minute, Ahasuerus could take someone that he loves and kills them. And maybe that's one reason behind the Vashti story. Or I could twist it. I could say Vashti's story actually helps me to understand how Esther actually was able to save the Jewish people. I need Vashti's story to understand Esther's. Because if you think about Vashti's story, Ahasuerus makes a big party and he invites everyone in. He kills Vashti After that, right, all of a sudden he's alone in the palace. No one's allowed in. And if you come in, he kills you if he doesn't put out his scepter. He's a different man. Something changes when it comes to Ahasuerus. And not only is it that no one's allowed to talk to the king, but one guy becomes elevated above everybody else. In source number 42, all of a sudden we take Haman and we build him up and we give him a ring, and he's the most significant person. And then snap your fingers, and all of a sudden he's the enemy. And Ahasuerus comes and listens to Esther and kills him and hangs him on a tree. We have two different stories of these two people who are like the favorites of the king, who then falls in this very drastic way, very, very quickly. And you have to ask why. And what you realize is the minute that somebody looks like a threat to Ahasuerus, they all of a sudden are gone. When Vashti says no to Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus can't handle that, and therefore she has to die. When Haman all of a sudden is saying, I want to wear the king's clothes and I want to ride on the king's horse, Haman has to go as well. And if you look fascinatingly, source 43, when he gets mad at them and determines that they're supposed to die, the same language is used in the psukim. You're supposed to compare them, where all of a sudden he gets so angry, there's a fire burning in him. Using the word chema, he kills them, and all of a sudden that fire is abated, and all of a sudden he seems to be okay. And what triggers him in both of these stories is someone who seems to be a threat to his power. And now I understand why Esther is chosen. Vashti is the reason Esther is chosen, not because she's bad, but because she's different than Esther, different than her. Both could be positive, but different than her. Why does Ahasuerus love Esther? Because Vatisachim v'chesed lefanav, because she's obedient, because she's kind, because he realizes she's not going to stand up to him. She's not going to say no to him. She's the opposite personality of that of Vashti. And that is why he keeps testing her over and over. I'll give you half my kingdom. He wasn't going to give her half the kingdom. He was seeing if she'd say, oh, great, I'll take it. Or if she continues to say, no, 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 I just have a small request for you. Come to a party. I don't want your kingdom. And if you look, Esther plays him. If it's good for the king, if it's good in your eyes. Right? She talks to him in a way that is so extra respectful and sensitive to his feelings. And therefore, what you understand is that Vashti isn't necessarily there to be the contrast to Esther, the good versus the bad. That's not why she's there. She's there to explain to us, how did Esther succeed? Why was she chosen, and why did she succeed? And she succeeded because she acted as the opposite of Vashti. And therefore, if you take a step back and realize what we've done here is we've given two different approaches to the characters of Orpah and Vashti. They could be the contrast, the evil to our heroines. They could be the ones that we're supposed to look at as the negative and the opposite, and the personalities and the traits of our heroine characters, and therefore elevates our heroines to positive figures even more than what the pshat of the psukim are telling us. Or are they just a piece in the puzzle? Maybe because Orpah turns around, that's why Ruth says, okay, well, now I got to stay. And maybe because Vashti is dethroned or killed because of the way she treats Ahasuerus, Esther knows I got to be the opposite of Vashti, or maybe she is by personality trait, as respectful as possible so that I can get my way and so that I can save Am Yisrael. And therefore, hopefully that we see when we take this picture and we put it all together, Tanakh is filled with heroes, Tanakh is filled with villains, but Tanakh, just like our lives, are filled with these middle characters. They're not necessarily heroes and they're not necessarily villains, because life is complicated and life has people who make good choices and bad choices, who are a mixture of good and evil. And therefore, when we're looking at the stories of Tanakh, yes, are we supposed to try to figure out who's the extraordinary characters like Ruth and be like them? Sure. And are we supposed to be like the characters like Esther, who changes the landscape of the Jewish people? Yeah. But sometimes it's actually okay to do what's normal, to do what's expected like Orpah. And sometimes you can try to do what's right like Vashti, and it blows up in your face and doesn't turn out the way that you want to. And therefore, yes, we spend a lot of times analyzing the heroes of Tanakh and inspiring ourselves to be amazing like them. But I think sometimes we so quickly detest the villains and we make it simple. These are the people that we are not supposed to respect. But I think at the end end of the day, when we look at Tanakh a little bit deeper, and instead of labeling all of the other people that are not the heroes as villains, but we look at them in this more complex way, this more nuanced way, we actually learn that there are people out there in Tanakh that we can learn from. Yes, it's not Megillat, Vashti, and Orpah. That is true because they're not the heroes of the story. But maybe we can learn from them lessons. Sometimes, right, it is okay to do what is normal. And sometimes, like Vashti, maybe what you did is not the positive result at the end, but it leads to the positive result. Sometimes we don't know the actions that we take if they're going to lead to something even better in the future. And therefore, she was a piece of the puzzle, part of that line that led us to Esther and led us to the saving of the Jewish people. And therefore, I hope through a share like this, we can all recognize the complication and the grayness of life and the people around us, and we won't judge so quickly characters like that of Vashti and Orpah. I thank you all very much for joining me tonight on this share, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Nechama. Thank you for Dr. Price for really enhancing our Yom Tov, for introducing us to contrast characters. We look forward to the book and just sort of processing all of that remarkable material you shared with us. Thanks everyone for joining us. We wish you
Thank
all
you,
a
everyone.
wonderful Shavuot ahead. Thank
Thank
you.
Thank
you,
you.
everybody. Good
Yeah.
night.
Thanks, Samir.
Thanks,
Thank you
Samantha.
so much.